Today we're going to be demonstrating the correct casting technique for knee ankle foot orthoses to fit the Walkabout reciprocating gait unit. We'll now demonstrate the correct casting procedure with the patient supine on the examination table. Casting supine allows the whole limb to be held in the correct alignment in the sagittal and coronal planes, and also to maintain the foot in the appropriate degree of toe out relative to the rest of the leg. As part of the casting technique, I'll be using the USMC polyethylene quadrilateral casting brim. Not only have I found this to be useful in forming the proximal edge of the thigh section, but it also forms a flat surface on the medial wall of the thigh so that both surfaces remain parallel in the coronal plane. And in final makeup, the degree of toe out will be relative to this surface. Whilst casting the patient, there are a few points worth keeping in note for the correct alignment in the negative cast. One being that the knee is in 0 degrees extension, the ankle in approximately 2 to 3 degrees dorsiflexion, and the foot relative to the thigh approximately 5 to 10 degrees externally rotated. When positioning the brim and in the negative cast itself, it is important that the cast be taken as close as possible to the greater trochanter of the femur. The final product will finish just proximal to the greater trochanter. Therefore, it is necessary to cast up as close to this landmark as possible. Just prior to casting, I have secured the quadrilateral brim in the correct position relative to the degree of toe out that I wish to attain in the final cast. Prior to casting, it is important to mark all the normal bony landmarks that would normally be highlighted when taking a knee, ankle, foot orthosis cast. In addition to using the quadrilateral brim for correct alignment, I have found that the use of a square footboard with the addition of an EVA or foam wedge enables the correct angle of dorsiflexion to be set in the negative cast whilst the patient is lying supine. Utilising the quadrilateral brim on the thigh section of the cast forms a reference surface in the sagittal plane and will then allow this to be transferred directly to the positive cast, this being the reference plane to the line of progression. The flat surfaces on the casts ensures that when the Walkabout unit is attached, identical alignment is achieved bilaterally. The medial thigh surface is parallel to line of progression. From this surface, knee axis is perpendicular and toe out is approximately 5 to 10 degrees. With the use of a pair of body calipers, a measurement across the patient at the level of the greater trochanter should be taken as accurately as possible. This mediolateral dimension is very important to ensure adequate clearance for the walkabout unit. The total diameter should equal the width of the walkabout unit plus the individual diameter of each leg. Standard tracings taken of both legs at the same time prior to casting. Legs should be in symmetrical locations on a large single sheet of paper. Apart from standard landmarks, attention should be taken to locate height of perineum, as this is an important reference point for position of walkabout unit and medial trimline of plastic. When taking the negative cast, take the initial portion of the cast, that is, the below knee section from the foot to below the knee joint, and set the ankle in the correct degree of dorsiflexion using a foot positioning board. Once the ankle position has been set, it is then a matter of casting the rest of the patient's limb up to the quadrilateral brim. You can just come around and hold the leg up if you would normally do this. You just hold your hand behind the knee, Lisa. That's right. At this point of the casting procedure, I am merely maintaining the foot in the desired degree of dorsiflexion. Once the foot has been set firmly by the plaster and can hold itself in this position as I am correcting it to at the moment, then the rest of the leg can be cast and the board taken away at that point. I'll say it in a couple of minutes, why not? But actually makes it easy for casting. It is helpful if the assistant has a good working knowledge of anatomical position, as whilst the orthotist is casting the leg, the assistant can monitor the relative position of the foot to the thigh section of the cast, relative to the rest of the leg. That is the correct degree of toe out relative to the flattened surface of the thigh, and that the knee is in zero extension. This procedure, as demonstrated on the patient's right leg, will be identically replicated for the left leg. I'll now demonstrate the correct procedure for modifying the positive cast to accommodate the Walkabout reciprocating gait unit. For continuity of the procedure, the modification will be demonstrated on the right leg. However, for purposes of what I'm about to explain, I will show on the left positive cast. If whilst casting the correct degree of dorsiflexion is not attained, one can simply cut a wedge, as can be seen in the bottom of the left hand cast here, to bring the foot back to the desired degree of dorsiflexion. From this point, it is worthwhile going through the necessary alignment checks prior to commencing the modification. Prior to commencing positive modification, the first overall check is the desired degree of dorsiflexion in the foot. Simply check this by placing the whole cast on a level bench and using a goniometer set at 2 to 3 degrees dorsiflexion. Check this measurement against the cast. The second check in the sagittal plane is the overall alignment of the leg. This should be basically neutral throughout the midline of the thigh, the knee, and through the base of the heel. First, check that the knee is basically square to the ground or square to the horizontal. Then I have marked the long line of the foot. Modifying this angle of the Walkabout unit into the medial surface of the cast is done simply by the use of normal plaster modification tools. This angle will determine the separation of the patient's feet. That is, a judgment should be made on how much angle needs to be accommodated in the cast. Also checked on the spirit level. We can then mark the knee axis. Once the positive plaster has been modified to allow for the correct alignment and modified down to the correct overall dimensions of the patient, the cast can then be smoothed up and ready for vacuum forming of the polypropylene. We have now moved on from the positive modification of the plaster cast, and we've now advanced to the plastic forming of the knee ankle foot orthoses. For the Walkabout unit, we generally use 5mm or 1/4 inch polypropylene. In addition, at the ankle section of the AFO, we use CompCore carbon fiberglass inserts. Once we have completed the vacuum forming, you will see the precise position of these inserts in the AFO section and their relevance in the total function of the walkabout with the knee ankle foot orthoses. We have now taken you through the stages of measuring, casting and the necessary cast modification for the walkabout. And before we move on to the final stage of the static and dynamic alignment on the patient, it is worth taking a moment to check a very important measurement where the walkabout unit will be attached onto the orthoses of the legs. The top of the walkabout unit should be approximately 20 millimetres below the perineum. Thus, from our positive modification, our total diameter of the patient at 20 millimetres below the perineum plus an additional 20 millimetres below the top of the unit, that is 40 millimetres below the perineum, to the total measurement taken on the patient. The importance of this measurement being that if the dimension is too large, there will be a noticeable gap on each side of the patient, or if the measurement is too narrow, the patient will have difficulty locking the leg onto the unit itself.
if like that type, when we 2 years and 3 weeks, wait in 3 weeks, 2 years, 2 years is a bit wider. Like this, we. Yes.
Everybody gets choose one size bigger, one size bigger, one.
One of the reasons your Walkabout is useful is can you go there?
Are these physiotherapists? Was that you?
This is physiotherapy. Yes.
So Mr. Iwata and Mr. Takahashi.
Yeah. It's a me and
At the static alignment, a basic check is made of the trim line on the patient and observing any pressure points that may be evident at this stage. Particularly taking note that the proximal lateral trim line is just below the head of the graded trochanter. The trim lines around the knee joint and also the position of the pre-tibial strap. That is, the centre of the pre-tibial strap should cover the tibial tuberosity area. Ankle clearances should also be observed and any pressure areas noted. The patient is now in a comfortable degree of dorsiflexion for standing. Inside the shoe is an angled shoe insert, which I will demonstrate if we move once again to the proximal area. The trim line should basically follow the gluteal fold. With the top of the Walkabout unit being 20 mm below the perineum.
I had them, I bought them the last time when I was doing the training, I put them just before we finished the training.
We are now at the completed stage of the Walkabout fabrication process. Here I have the Walkabout fitted to the completed orthoses. Note that on the medial side, the plastic is trimmed just below the bolt head. You will note on the AFO section that we have a full-length foot plate and we have used Comcore carbon fibre inserts which are vacuum formed to the polypropylene at the time of fabrication. This amount of stiffening is sufficient for providing stability in the Walkabout. A final check that the Walkabout unit is correctly aligned when attached to the orthoses should be done in the following manner. Firstly, to see that the Walkabout unit is perpendicular to the line of progression. Also, that the unit is horizontal to the ground. And finally, the Walkabout unit attached to the orthoses with the knee joints square to the line of progression and the appropriate degree of toe out to the line of progression. In closing, we should point out that the video you have just seen is a guide to casting, cast modification, fabrication and fitting of the Walkabout unit. Attention should of course be paid to the important areas of measuring, alignment and correct fitting. The more experience one gains in fitting the Walkabout unit, the greater the understanding of the principles that have been put forward in this training video.